For my 18th birthday, my parents threw a huge party. String lights wrapped around the oak trees, champagne glasses glittered under the backyard lanterns, and a jazz trio played near the pool. It should have been perfect, the kind of celebration a daughter dreams of. Only one problem: it wasn't for me. I stood near the edge of the deck, watching a crowd of relatives, neighbors, and my parents' colleagues swarm around the person of the night, my sister, Emily. The cake, a towering 3-layer masterpiece covered in gold frosting, had a glittering number 18 on top. And beneath it, in elegant cursive, was her name: Emily Hart. My heart sank the moment I saw it. It wasn't a mistake. 2 days earlier, Emily had announced she wanted to celebrate her 18th again because, as she put it, last year's party wasn't big enough. And people didn't get to see my glow-up. My parents laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. My mother had spent weeks calling caterers, hiring photographers, and ordering decorations that matched Emily's favorite color, champagne gold. And I, the real 18-year-old, was told to be a good sport. Dad said, "You'll have your moment next time, Lena. Let your sister enjoy this one." So here I was, the invisible guest at my own birthday. People smiled at me as they walked by, but not one of them asked how it felt to be 18. I stood near the buffet table, the smell of truffle pasta and roasted salmon filling the air, and wondered if anyone even remembered why this date mattered. When the MC clinked his glass to quiet the room, I thought, for a brief second, that it was finally for me. He grinned and announced, "Let's give a warm round of applause for Emily Hart, turning 18, again." The crowd erupted in laughter and cheers. Cameras flashed. My mother clasped her hands proudly, mouthing to me across the table, "Smile, Lena." I tried. I really did. I clapped like everyone else, but something inside me cracked with each flash of the camera. Emily walked up the small stage Dad had built near the fountain, the fairy lights behind her twinkling like 1,000 eyes. She grabbed the microphone, tossed her hair, and said with a playful smirk, "Thank you for celebrating me again. I mean, who says you can only turn 18 once, right?" Laughter filled the air again, the kind that feels rehearsed, hollow, endless. I could feel the warmth of tears gathering, but I swallowed hard and smiled instead. My hands trembled as I reached for a glass of sparkling cider. I had helped plan this party. I had strung half those lights 2 days ago, arranged the flowers, even helped Mom choose the playlist. It was supposed to be a shared effort, one last family memory before I left for design school in the fall. Instead, I had designed my own erasure. When Emily finished her little speech, I took a step toward the stage. Maybe I could still say something, even just a thank you. But before I could climb the stairs, my mother's hand touched my arm. Her nails were painted the same gold as the table runners. "Let Emily do it first," she whispered with that practiced smile she used for guests. "We don't want to confuse people." Confuse people. As if my own birthday was an inconvenience, I stood there frozen, the laughter echoing like static in my ears. I retreated to the garden's edge, the sound of clinking glasses and the DJ's remix of pop songs bleeding into one another. The night smelled of champagne and cut roses, too sweet, almost suffocating. I stared at the glowing pool water, where the floating candles shimmered like little suns, and thought about how strange it was to feel lonely in a house full of people. A group of Emily's friends passed me, giggling, one of them saying, "She really outdid herself this time." They didn't even notice me standing there. I looked back at my parents. Dad was shaking hands with his business partner. Mom was posing for a photo with Emily, both of them laughing into the camera. And in that perfect, glittering frame, I wasn't even a shadow. The tears finally blurred my vision, making the lights smear into golden streaks. I set my glass down and whispered, almost to no one, "Happy birthday to me." Then I turned away before anyone could see the cracks in my smile. The music from the backyard faded into a low, trembling pulse behind me, bass and laughter mixing into something almost unreal. The sound carried down the quiet Austin street, growing softer with every step I took. My heels sank into the dirt as I cut across the lawn, the hem of my white dress catching dew and soil. When I reached the gate, I hesitated for a moment, waiting for someone to notice, for my mother's voice to call my name, for my father to ask where I was going. But no one did. The door to the house opened briefly, spilling warm yellow light and a burst of EDM into the night, and I caught a glimpse of Emily dancing in the center of the crowd, the shimmer of her dress flashing like a mirror ball. The door shut again, and the laughter muffled. The air outside was cool and heavy with the scent of rain-soaked grass. I slipped off my shoes and started walking barefoot down the road. The rough asphalt scratched against my skin, but I didn't care. A breeze swept in from the direction of the river, lifting the loose strands of my hair and brushing against my shoulders. It felt like something was whispering, "Go." Behind me, the faint echo of applause rippled one last time, and I knew they were cutting the cake with her name on it. For years, I'd thought if I tried hard enough, if I stayed quiet, polite, helpful, they'd finally see me. I had spent my childhood sitting in the front row of Emily's cheerleading competitions, clutching flowers for her after every win. I designed her posters for the school elections she always won, stayed up late editing her essays when she was too tired to write, and smiled through every teacher's comparison. "You're Emily's little sister? She's just wonderful." Wonderful, that word clung to her like perfume and hung around me like fog. When I was 15, I made her a handmade scrapbook for her birthday. She barely flipped through it before saying, "It's cute, but Mom's buying me an iPad, so maybe you could have just saved your allowance?" That night, I tore a page out of my sketchbook, a half-finished drawing of a bedroom I had imagined designing one day, and swore that one day I would build something that couldn't be ignored. But promises made to yourself at 15 feel small when you're 18 and standing alone in the dark. By the time I reached the bus stop on South Congress, my dress was streaked with dirt, and my feet were bleeding slightly from the pavement. The streets were nearly empty, just the hum of streetlights and a passing car every few minutes. I sat down on the cold metal bench, clutching my small purse inside it, my phone, a charger, a sketchbook, and the $600 I'd saved from a summer internship. I didn't have a plan. I only had a direction. New York. It was the only place that had ever sounded big enough to hold a dream. The electronic billboard across the street flickered between ads for restaurants and travel agencies, and when it showed a skyline, tall buildings glinting under a sunrise, I took it as a sign. I opened my phone and searched for the next available ticket north. A bus leaving in 45 minutes. I booked it without thinking twice. As I waited, I stared at my reflection in the dark glass of the bus shelter. The girl looking back at me didn't look like the one who spent the day decorating her own birthday party for someone else. Her makeup was smudged, mascara staining under her eyes, but her expression was calm, almost steady. It was as if something had clicked into place, a kind of quiet surrender that didn't feel like defeat. The sound of the bus pulling up broke my thoughts. The driver, a man in his 50s with tired eyes, glanced at my dress and said, "Late night?" I smiled faintly and replied, "Something like that." I handed him my printed ticket, climbed aboard, and found a seat by the window near the back. The air inside smelled faintly of coffee and dust. As the engine started, I pulled my knees close, watching the city lights slide past gas stations, diners still open, a couple arguing outside a motel, a stray dog crossing the street. Austin was shrinking behind me, and for a second, fear fluttered in my chest. I didn't know anyone in New York. I didn't even know where I would sleep tomorrow night. But staying felt impossible. Every corner of that house had become a mirror reflecting Emily's perfection and my invisibility. I pulled out my sketchbook from the bag and flipped to a blank page. The vibration of the bus made my pencil shake as I began to draw a room with tall windows, soft light, plants by the sill, and an empty chair facing the sunrise. I didn't know whose home it was, but I knew I wanted to make it real someday. The memories of the night replayed in fragments. Mom's hand stopping me, Emily's laughter, the crowd cheering. And under it all, a single thought repeated in my mind like a mantra. They'll forget me tomorrow anyway. That realization didn't hurt as much as I thought it would. Maybe that was freedom. The bus merged onto the highway, and the dark horizon stretched ahead. The hum of the tires on the road became a rhythm steady, almost comforting. I leaned my head against the window, watching raindrops gather on the glass and slide down in crooked lines, turning the passing lights into soft blurs. The city disappeared completely, swallowed by the night. Somewhere near Dallas, I dozed off. In my dream, I was standing inside a vast, unfinished room, bare walls, high ceilings, open space, and I could hear a faint echo of my own voice bouncing back. No laughter. No comparisons. Just me. When the morning sun finally bled through the windows of the bus, painting the seats in pale orange light, I woke to see the skyline of Manhattan rising in the distance. My heart pounded with something that wasn't fear anymore. It was the thrill of standing on the edge of the unknown. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running from something, I was walking toward it. New York didn't welcome me with open arms. It greeted me with the smell of exhaust, the screech of trains, and the hard truth that nobody here cared who I was, where I came from, or what I'd left behind. The bus dropped me at Port Authority just after sunrise. People moved around me like a tide, coffee cups in hand, earbuds in, rushing somewhere important. I stood there, gripping my worn-out tote, pretending I belonged to that rhythm. The city pulsed, alive and indifferent. The first few weeks were survival in its rawest form. I found a shared room in Queens, a small space with creaking floors, paint peeling from the walls, and a window that faced a brick wall instead of sunlight. My roommate, a nursing student from the Bronx, kept to herself. We shared an old fridge and a broken lamp. Rent ate most of my savings, and I picked up part-time work at a coffee shop near Jackson Heights, wiping tables, steaming milk, and trying to make myself invisible enough not to be yelled at, but visible enough to keep the job. Every morning before my shift, I sat by that narrow window with my laptop, taking online classes in interior design. I couldn't afford real college, but I found free architecture modules, color theory courses, and online lectures from design schools I could only dream of attending. The Wi-Fi lagged, the walls were thin, and sometimes the sounds of my roommates crying blended with the hum of the fridge. Still, I studied. Customers came and went, each day blending into the next. Some were kind, most were rushed, and a few treated me like background noise. Once, a man snapped his fingers at me because I didn't hear him call for an extra espresso shot. "You people never listen," he muttered. I bit my tongue until I tasted metal. That night, after cleaning spilled coffee grounds from the floor, I sat in the empty cafe, staring at my reflection in the window and whispered, "Keep going." Every time I remembered my mother's eyes, half pride, half disappointment, I used that memory like fuel. It was during one of those slow, gray mornings that everything began to change. The cafe was nearly empty. A woman in her 60s sat by the corner table, sketching on a tablet, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. She came every Tuesday, always ordered an Americano, and never stayed long. But that morning, I noticed she was looking at the mural sketches I doodled on a napkin during a break. I froze when she called out softly, "Did you draw this?" She held the napkin like it was something fragile. "Yes, it's just a habit," I stammered. "It's not a habit," she said, her voice firm but kind. "It's instinct. You've got an eye for balance. For space." She looked at me with the kind of attention that felt both terrifying and electric. "Ever thought of doing this for real?" Her name was Margaret Holloway. I didn't know it then, but she was the founder of Holloway & Co., a boutique interior design studio known for transforming old, forgotten spaces into homes full of warmth and story. The next day, she came back and left her card on the counter. "Call me," she said. "I might have a small internship opening. It doesn't pay much yet, but it could be something." That night, I sat on my narrow bed and stared at the card until the letters blurred. I almost didn't call. A part of me still whispered that I wasn't enough, that I'd just embarrass myself like always. But another part, quieter yet stronger, said, "What if you finally are?" The next morning, I took the subway into Manhattan, clutching my only portfolio, a folder of sketches, some printed 3D models from online exercises, and a dream that barely fit inside my chest. Margaret's studio was tucked inside a converted warehouse in Chelsea. The space smelled like cedar and fresh paint. Mood boards covered the walls, samples of wood and fabric stacked on every surface. I'd never seen so much beauty created from ruin. Margaret glanced through my sketches while sipping her coffee. "You design like someone who's been invisible," she said finally. I blinked, unsure how to take that. She smiled. "That's a compliment. Invisible people notice details the rest of us forget." She slid one of my sketches back to me. "Let's see what you can do when someone's finally watching." The internship started the next week. It was brutal. I ran errands, fetched supplies, labeled paint samples, and spent nights learning design software until my eyes burned. Margaret didn't hand out praise easily. She'd glance at my layouts and say, "Too safe. Make me feel something." I began to understand that design wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about emotion, memory, identity. She pushed me to think of light as language, color as mood, space as story. At night, when everyone else had gone home, I stayed behind, rearranging mock-up rooms under the studio's dim pendant lights. Sometimes, I'd imagine my parents walking into one of them, how they'd pause, look around, and maybe, finally, see what I could create. But I didn't build for them anymore. I built for the girl who once strung fairy lights for a party that wasn't hers. The months passed, and New York slowly became less hostile. The city still roared, but I was beginning to find my own rhythm within its noise. My pay barely covered food, but Margaret had started giving me small projects, designing reading nooks, arranging art displays for local clients. The first time she introduced me to a client as one of our designers, I had to stop myself from crying. On weekends, I'd take long walks through the city museums, antique markets, thrift stores. I collected discarded items, cracked picture frames, chipped tiles, old lamps. I fixed them, repainted them, turned them into something new. My studio corner began to fill with secondhand beauty. Every piece reminded me that things could be broken and still belong somewhere. One evening, Margaret stopped by my workspace, running her hand across a table I'd built from reclaimed wood. "You know," she said quietly, "you have a gift for giving things a second life." She looked at me, smiling faintly. "Maybe that's what you've been doing for yourself all along." Her words stayed with me. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving, I was transforming. The invisible daughter, the backup plan, the silent helper, she was still there, but she was learning to draw her own outline. By winter, the studio had become my second home. I spent late nights watching snow fall through the skylight, sketching dream interiors for apartments I'd never own. There was always music in the background, soft jazz, the hum of heaters, the scratch of pencils on tracing paper. Margaret would sometimes find me asleep at my drafting desk, throw a blanket over my shoulders, and leave quietly. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't easy, but it was mine. Every sketch, every bruise, every late night built something inside me that no one could take away. The day I signed my first independent project, a small cafe redesign in Brooklyn, I stood in the empty space and closed my eyes. The air smelled of dust and plaster, sunlight streaming through a cracked window. For the first time, I didn't feel like a visitor in my own life. I belonged there. That was the moment I realized awakening isn't loud or sudden. It's the quiet decision to keep building, even when no one claps. 3 years passed, and somehow, the city that once swallowed me whole had begun to echo with my name. I was 21 when the dream that once lived in the margins of my sketchbook finally stepped into the light. Lena Atelier, the words looked surreal on the frosted glass door of the studio I rented in a converted garment factory in Brooklyn. The space wasn't large, just a single open floor with exposed brick, wide windows, and uneven floors that groaned when you walked across them. But when I turned on the lights for the first time, seeing my sketches pinned to the walls and reclaimed pieces lined up like quiet soldiers, I whispered to myself, "You did it." I called my design style soul architecture, a philosophy built on the idea that every object, every wall, and every forgotten piece of furniture holds a memory waiting to be reshaped. It wasn't about perfection or minimalism. It was about story. About turning what was broken into something beautiful again. The same way I had done with myself. Word of mouth spread faster than I expected. Clients came in curious, then left enchanted. They loved that I didn't design for luxury. I designed for feeling. I blended light with shadow, layered raw textures with warmth, repurposed cracked marble into mosaic walls, and transformed rusted metal frames into sculptural shelves. My hands were always stained with paint or glue, my fingers bruised from hammering, but I didn't care. Every mark felt like proof of existence. Then, one morning, everything changed. I was sitting at my drafting table, half asleep, when my assistant, Kai, a young art student I'd hired part-time, burst through the door, holding a rolled-up magazine. "You've been featured," he said, breathless. Elle Decor. Elle Decor, Lena. The article was titled, "The Girl Who Turned Ruins into Beauty." My name filled the first line. They'd found me through a small blog post Margaret had written months earlier, describing me as a designer who doesn't just restore spaces, but resurrects them. The feature told my story: the move from Texas, the concept of soul architecture, the idea that beauty could grow from what the world discarded. Photos of my studio filled the pages, sunlight streaming through the windows, a chandelier made from old glass bottles, a coffee table crafted from salvaged beams. Within a week, the phone didn't stop ringing. A boutique hotel wanted me to design its new lobby. A record label asked me to create a workspace that felt like forgiveness. Even brands that once ignored my emails suddenly wanted collaborations. Kai and I barely slept that month. We'd order takeout at midnight, sketch until dawn, and laugh over energy drinks when exhaustion made us delirious. But beneath the chaos, there was a quiet, steady pride. When the checks started coming in, I didn't rush to spend them. I remembered every sleepless night, every landlord threat, every meal I'd skipped. I saved, planned, and finally made the boldest decision of my life. I bought a small penthouse loft in Manhattan. Not the kind with private elevators and marble bathtubs, the kind that used to be an artist's studio, with rough beams, skylights, and one perfect terrace overlooking the city skyline. It was an old building near Soho, its bricks weathered and worn. The owner, a retired sculptor, agreed to sell it after seeing my designs. "You'll bring it back to life," he'd said. It took 6 months to renovate, but when it was done, it felt like a heartbeat made of light and silence. Exposed beams, white plaster walls, reclaimed oak floors, and tall windows that stretched toward the sky. I placed a single olive tree in the center, its roots wrapped in a ceramic pot I'd molded myself. That space became my sanctuary, a home I had built from the fragments of every place I'd been denied. But I wasn't done building. With the success of Lena Atelier, I decided to hold an exhibition, my first public showcase of installations and designs inspired by my philosophy of transformation. I called it Echoes of Silence. The name came from a thought that had followed me for years, that silence isn't emptiness, it's memory waiting to be heard. The exhibit would feature pieces created from reclaimed materials, chairs made from piano wood, lamps forged from rusted copper pipes, mirrors framed by broken window panes. Each object would tell a story of neglect turned into purpose. I wanted people to walk in and feel what it meant to rebuild yourself from fragments. As the invitations went out, I sat at my kitchen table one night and stared at 3 names in my contact list that I hadn't typed in years. Mom, Dad, Emily. I hovered over them for a long time. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper, a question of whether I still owed them any part of my story. In the end, I wrote the invitation anyway. Dear Mom, Dad, and Emily. I'm hosting my first solo exhibition next month in Manhattan. It's called Echoes of Silence. I thought you might want to see what I've been working on these past few years. No expectations, just an open door. Lena. I mailed it without ceremony, dropped it into the blue mailbox on Lafayette Street, and walked home through the crisp spring air, unsure whether I wanted them to come or not. The next few weeks blurred into preparation, installing lights, adjusting layouts, redoing signs. The night before the opening, I barely slept. Margaret stopped by the gallery with flowers and said, "You've come far, Lena. Remember to breathe tomorrow." When the doors finally opened, the space filled quickly. Art critics, influencers, designers, and clients' faces I'd never imagined would care about my work wandered among the pieces, whispering words like haunting and honest. A journalist asked what inspired me to create from broken things. I smiled and said, because everything worth building starts in silence. As I glanced around the room, part of me still searched the crowd for familiar faces: my mother's sharp heels, my father's steady posture, Emily's gleaming smile. But none appeared. Only strangers with kind eyes, holding champagne flutes and taking photos beside my work. Later that night, when the crowd thinned and the music softened, I stepped out to the terrace. The city stretched beneath me, endless and glittering. Kai joined me, holding 2 glasses of wine. "Your family didn't come?" he asked gently. I shook my head, forcing a small smile. "No. But maybe that's okay." We stood there in silence for a moment. The wind lifted the edges of my hair, carrying the faint hum of traffic from below. Inside, people were still murmuring about my art, my story, my courage. Yet all I could think about was how strange it was how the ones who had once refused to see me would probably read about me tomorrow in a magazine. When I walked back inside, I found Margaret near one of my installations, a suspended chandelier made of shattered glass, the pieces arranged in perfect balance. She looked up at me with a proud, knowing smile. "You've built something extraordinary, Lena." I exhaled slowly. "I just wanted them to see it." She tilted her head. "They will. Maybe not in person. But someday, they'll have to face what they lost when they refused to listen." That night, after everyone left, I sat on the gallery floor among the remnants of the evening, empty glasses, confetti, and the soft hum of the exit lights. The silence didn't hurt this time. It felt full, almost comforting, like a heartbeat echoing in an empty room. As Kai locked up, he glanced back and asked if I was coming. I smiled faintly and said, "In a minute." I stayed there, tracing the edges of the gallery's white walls with my eyes, letting it sink in that this light, this space, this life had once been a dream drawn on a bus window. When I finally rose to leave, I turned off the lights one by one until only a single lamp remained, illuminating a plaque near the entrance that read, "Echoes of Silence, curated by Lena Hart." I touched the plaque gently and whispered to myself, "Guess some echoes are just meant to stay unanswered." Then I walked out into the New York night, where the city lights shimmered like fragments of all the pieces I had finally put back together. A week after the exhibition, the flowers had started to wilt, their petals curling like tired applause. The gallery lights were dimmed now, and the emails from journalists had slowed. I sat at my kitchen counter in the loft, sipping cold coffee, half expecting a message that never came. The silence was louder than ever. I told myself I didn't care, that the absence of their voices was nothing new, but deep down, I kept glancing at my phone, waiting for a number I'd memorized since childhood to appear. When the notification finally came, my heart betrayed me. It leapt. The name on the screen, Mom. I hesitated before opening it. The message was short, polite, and sharp around the edges, the kind of apology written by someone who didn't want to feel guilty for long. "Sorry, we couldn't come. Emily's having a hard time with her breakup. You understand." That was it. No mention of the exhibition, no word of pride or curiosity. Just Emily, as always, the axis around which the world apparently revolved. I reread the message twice, almost laughing at its predictability. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, and I typed back 2 sentences that carried years of exhaustion. Of course, I always do. I put my phone face down on the counter. The ceramic mug trembled slightly as I set it aside. I looked around the loft at the light spilling through the tall windows, at the olive tree in the center, at the pieces I'd poured my soul into, and felt something strange. Not sadness, but a kind of numb clarity. For so long, I had mistaken their silence for power. But now I realized it was just smallness. Their inability to see me said less about who I was and more about who they'd chosen to be. That night, I logged into Instagram out of habit, scrolling past design accounts and industry posts. Then I froze. Emily's name appeared at the top of my feed, tagged in a news story. It was a selfie of her, taken in front of a mirror with perfect lighting, mascara smudged artfully down her cheek. The caption read, "Sisters who try to steal your spotlight deserve the silence they get." The familiar sting crept up my spine, anger, humiliation, disbelief, but this time, I didn't look away. I studied her reflection, the perfect image of someone who'd been adored for too long and never learned how to live without it. I remembered all the small ways she'd made sure I stayed smaller, borrowing my clothes without asking, correcting me in front of guests, making jokes about my art projects. I remembered how she once told me, "You're like a background color necessary, but never the main one." I used to believe her, but not anymore. I put the phone down and walked to my drafting table. The city outside was breathing sirens, wind, a distant honk, and inside, the silence stretched wide and heavy. I took out a clean sheet of paper, the kind I used to start new designs, and instead of sketching lines or angles, I wrote a title in black ink across the top. Redesigning the space called family. That phrase had come to me months ago, but I hadn't known what to do with it. Now I did. The following morning, I received an email from a local TEDx curator who had attended my exhibition. He'd seen my work, read the Elle Decor article, and wanted to know if I'd consider giving a talk. "Your story," he wrote, "feels like something people need to hear, especially your perspective on rebuilding from silence." It felt like fate's quiet nod. I accepted without hesitation. For the next few weeks, I buried myself in preparation. I approached the talk the same way I approached design, starting with space, structure, and emotion. I asked myself, what does it mean to build family? What happens when the foundation cracks? Can love be renovated? Each night, I rehearsed in front of the mirror, timing my words, refining the rhythm of each line. I didn't want revenge or pity, I wanted truth. I wanted to speak the language I had once been denied. In between rehearsals, I'd still get occasional updates about home, never directly from my parents, but through friends of friends who followed Emily online. They said she was working on a lifestyle blog now, partnering with small brands, selling curated aesthetics. My mother appeared in some of her videos, always perfectly poised, pretending that the last few years hadn't happened. I wondered if they ever mentioned me. Probably not. Maybe, in their version of the story, I was just a phase that embarrassed them, a daughter who chose art over family, or some easy phrase to soften the guilt. But guilt wasn't my concern anymore. The night before the TEDx event, I went back to the gallery where my exhibition had been held. The room was empty now, the installations taken down, leaving faint outlines on the walls where the frames had hung. I stood in the middle of that blank space and imagined it filled again not with art, but with memory. The sound of my mother's voice. The way Emily laughed when people clapped for her. The echo of my own silence in every room I'd ever been ignored in. And then I whispered aloud, "Thank you." Not because they deserved gratitude, but because their neglect had become the soil from which I grew. Every slight, every dismissal, every invisible birthday had shaped the woman who now stood in her own gallery, her own home, her own life. The next morning, I woke early. The air outside was cool and clear. I dressed simply black trousers, a cream blouse, and tied my hair back. When I looked in the mirror, I hardly recognized the girl who had once strung fairy lights for someone else's celebration. This version of me looked composed, still, but alive. At the venue, I stepped onto the small red circle marked on the stage. The lights were blinding at first, the audience hidden in shadow. My hands trembled slightly, but when I took a breath, it was as though the air carried every word I'd waited years to say. I opened with a simple sentence. Sometimes, the walls you build to protect yourself become the home you always needed. A hush fell over the room. And for the first time in my life, people were listening. When I finished my rehearsal that day, I stood by the empty seats and imagined my parents sitting somewhere in the back, Emily scrolling her phone, half listening. I smiled at the thought, because even if they never came, even if they never listened, the truth was already out there, shaping itself into something stronger than their silence. The rejection that once broke me had become my blueprint. And tomorrow, the world would hear it for the first time. The stage lights were warm against my skin, bright enough to erase the faces in the crowd. The world beyond that red circle dissolved into darkness, and for a moment, I felt weightless, suspended between the life I'd lived and the one I was about to claim. The microphone caught the sound of my breath as I leaned forward and said softly, "Sometimes, the walls you build to protect yourself become the home you always needed." The silence that followed was deep, attentive. I could hear the faint hum of the lights, the shifting of a chair somewhere in the back. It reminded me of the quiet after a storm, fragile but expectant. I told them I was an interior designer, that I worked with broken spaces, old rooms, forgotten structures. "I rebuild," I said. "I give things a second life." Then I paused. But for a long time, I didn't realize I was trying to rebuild myself too. The audience didn't move. I could feel them leaning closer, as if the air itself was holding its breath. So I told them a story. I didn't name names. I didn't mention a city, or a date, or the fact that it was my 18th birthday. I just said, once, there was a girl who thought love meant staying quiet. She believed that if she worked hard enough, helped enough, smiled enough, she'd be seen. But she wasn't. And one day, even her birthday was given to someone else. My voice trembled, just slightly. I let it. She stood there, watching people celebrate someone else under lights she'd hung herself. The cake was beautiful, 3 layers, gold frosting, her sister's name written in cursive. She didn't cry. She just walked out the door and never looked back. A few people gasped softly. Others sat still, eyes fixed on me. I continued. She didn't leave to hurt anyone. She left to find silence. And in that silence, she found something louder than approval, her own voice. I saw a woman in the second row nodding slowly, a man in the front wiping at his eye. The story was mine, but I could feel it becoming theirs. That night, I said, I learned that sometimes love needs to lose you to see you. And that sometimes, silence isn't a punishment, it's space. The kind of space where you finally learn how to breathe. The words left me like exhaled ghosts. For years, I had buried them under work, ambition, and art. Saying them out loud felt like setting something free. I told them about New York, the tiny room in Queens with the window that faced a brick wall. The nights I fell asleep sketching designs by candlelight, the first time someone told me I had an eye for space and soul. I told them about building furniture from trash, turning scraps of wood into tables, rusted pipes into lamps, and silence into structure. I realized, I said, that family isn't always made of blood. Sometimes it's built from the people who see you when no one else does. Sometimes it's the mentor who believes in you, or the stranger who says, I love what you've created. Sometimes family is the home you build for yourself. A ripple of applause broke through, hesitant at first, then growing. I let it fade before speaking again. I used to think I was running away from my family, I continued. But really, I was running toward a version of myself they couldn't imagine. One that didn't need permission to exist. I smiled, then not a polite, restrained smile, but one that felt real. I'm not angry anymore, I said. Because anger still gives them space inside me. I'd rather fill that space with light. The final part of my talk wasn't rehearsed. I looked down at my notes, then folded them away. If you've ever been invisible in a room that should have been yours, I said, remember this: you don't have to wait for an invitation to build your own table. You can create your own room. Redesign the space called family on your own terms. When I stepped back from the microphone, the audience rose to their feet. It wasn't the thunderous applause of a performance, it was softer, slower, like the sound of understanding. The kind that sinks deep. I didn't bow. I just nodded, whispered a thank you, and left the stage with my heart pounding. Backstage, I sat alone for a long time, my hands still shaking. One of the event organizers came over and placed a bottle of water beside me. That was, she began, then stopped. That was real. I smiled, still catching my breath. That's all I wanted it to be. The talk was uploaded that night. At first, I didn't pay attention. I'd done what I came to do, speak my truth and let it go. But within days, my inbox began to fill. Messages from strangers all over the world, students, single mothers, men who hadn't spoken to their fathers in years. They wrote, "I was her once. Thank you for giving words to what I couldn't say. I left my house last year. I thought I was alone." The video hit 1 million views, then 2. Someone clipped the line, "You don't have to wait for an invitation to build your own table," and it started circulating on social media. People wrote it on signs, shared it as captions, printed it on notebooks. Someone even tattooed it on their wrist and tagged me in the post. Soon, the headlines began appearing. Designer Lena Hart, the girl who walked out of her own birthday. From silence to spotlight, the woman redefining family. The story I'd once tried to bury had become the story that defined me. Interview requests poured in. Elle Decor asked for a follow-up feature, this time not about design but about resilience. The New York Times called. A podcast host wanted to talk about healing through creativity. Even a major lifestyle network wanted to film a short documentary. At first, the attention felt overwhelming. I'd spent so long blending into the background that visibility felt almost violent. But then, as the days passed, I realized something. People weren't applauding me for being perfect, they were thanking me for being honest. For being human. In one of the interviews, the host asked, "If you could say one thing to the people who once made you feel invisible, what would it be?" I thought for a long moment before answering. "I'd say thank you," I said quietly. Because without the silence, I would never have learned how to build my own sound. When the interview aired, that line became another quote people repeated. And though the words spread far, their meaning stayed intimate, mine alone. That weekend, I went for a walk through Central Park. The trees were bare, winter sunlight glinting off the frozen lake. My phone buzzed constantly, notifications, interviews, invitations, but I ignored them. I wanted to listen to the city instead, to hear the rhythm of my own steps against the pavement. Somewhere between the bridge and the bench where I used to sketch, I realized that I wasn't lonely anymore. I had built something larger than approval, something that could outlast silence. That night, when I returned home, I opened my laptop and saw the view count had passed 5 million. The comment section was flooded with people sharing their stories, their pain, their awakenings. I sat back in my chair, eyes stinging, and whispered into the quiet, "This is what healing sounds like." For years, I had dreamed of being heard. Now, the world was listening. And for the first time in my life, the echo that came back didn't hurt, it sang. The first time I realized the video had gone viral, I was standing in line at a cafe near my studio, waiting for a cappuccino. The barista kept glancing at me like she was trying to place where she'd seen me before. When she finally handed me my drink, she smiled nervously and said, "You're her, right? The girl from the TED Talk. The one who walked out of her own birthday." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Her words hit like a small, surreal echo of everything I'd said on that stage. I managed a quiet laugh. "Yeah," I said. "That's me." That afternoon, I checked my phone for the first time in days. My inbox was overflowing, not just messages but essays from strangers. One woman from Ohio wrote that she'd left an abusive marriage after watching my video. A college student in Seoul said my story gave her the courage to switch majors. Someone from South Africa sent a photo of a renovated orphanage wall painted with my quote, "Build your own table." The video's title, "The Girl Who Walked Out of Her Own Birthday," had caught fire online. Within 2 weeks, it climbed to YouTube's top trending list. Journalists dissected every sentence of my talk. Reaction channels analyzed it, therapists discussed it on podcasts, and even design magazines quoted me alongside my work. The world had given my pain a platform, and for the first time, I didn't feel exposed, I felt understood. I scrolled through the comments late that night, curled on my couch in the soft glow of the city. There were thousands of them. I was her once. She turned pain into purpose. This hit harder than therapy. I showed this to my mom. We cried together. No. And in the middle of it all, one that stopped me cold. I wish my sister would hear this before it's too late. I stared at that one for a long time. It reminded me of Emily. The next morning, my phone buzzed relentlessly. Every outlet seemed to want a piece of the story. Vogue Living wanted to feature my Seoul architecture designs. Elle Decor wrote a follow-up article titled, "The Silence That Built a Star." Harper's Bazaar asked me to speak about creative independence. Even design brands began reaching out for collaborations. My assistant Kai looked up from his laptop, wide-eyed. "You just hit 1 million followers, Lena." I blinked. That can't be right. He turned his screen toward me, and there it was, the number glowing in bold, 1,023. My face, once barely visible in a crowd, was now everywhere. The world was clapping. But the silence from home was deafening. It didn't last long, though, because 3 nights later, I woke to a storm not in the sky, but online. Emily had posted. It was a photo of her sitting on the edge of her bed, tears streaming down her face, captioned, "Some people love to play the victim. Funny how they forget who helped them shine first." The comments exploded, half defending her, half accusing her of jealousy. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The internet had already decided. Within hours, her post was taken down, but screenshots spread like wildfire. The next day, I got a text from a number I hadn't seen in 3 years. "Mom, we saw your video. It's everywhere. Emily's upset. Maybe you should call her, try to fix this. You're both adults now." I stared at the message until it blurred. It wasn't concern, it was damage control. I typed, deleted, and retyped, but, in the end, I sent nothing. For the first time in my life, I chose silence, not the kind they used to give me, but the kind I owned. A few hours later, my father sent an email. Short, formal. "I watched your speech. You've made quite a name for yourself. Congratulations. I hope you understand your sister's emotional nature. She means well." I laughed quietly to myself. Even now, they couldn't say I'd done something good without centering her feelings. It was always about Emily. Always. That night, I walked onto the terrace of my penthouse and looked down at the city lights. They blinked like thousands of distant heartbeats. Somewhere in that endless sprawl were people who had listened to me, truly listened, and changed something in their lives. I closed my eyes and breathed in the cold air. The ache in my chest wasn't pain anymore, it was gratitude. But the next morning, Kai rushed into the studio with a worried look. "You need to see this." He handed me his tablet. A local gossip blog had published an article with the headline, "Sister of Viral Designer Speaks Out. She's Lying About Our Family." Emily had given an interview. She didn't mention me by name, but everyone knew. She spoke about a sibling who exaggerated things for sympathy. About how family drama shouldn't be monetized. The backlash was immediate and brutal. People flooded her comments with clips from my TEDx talk, calling her bitter, jealous, cruel. Her sponsors dropped her within days. It should have felt like justice, but instead, I felt tired. I didn't want revenge, I wanted peace. I knew how it felt to be swallowed by noise. And now, she was drowning in it. Later that week, Margaret called me. Her voice, calm as ever, carried a quiet warning. Success doesn't erase pain, Lena. It just gives it a louder stage. Don't let the applause become another kind of prison. Her words sank deep. She was right. The world had finally taken my side, but sides are walls, and I'd spent my whole life learning to rebuild them. That weekend, I turned off my phone and spent 2 days alone in the studio. No music, no screens. Just me, my sketches, and the sound of rain against the glass. I drew something new, a concept for a space that didn't divide or decorate, but healed. A circular room made entirely of reclaimed glass, where light could pass freely through every surface. No shadows. No hierarchy. Just openness. When Kai saw it later, he asked, "What's it called?" I smiled faintly. Home. The next month was a blur of interviews and travel, but beneath it all was a strange, steady stillness. People called me an icon of quiet strength, a voice for invisible daughters. The girl who turned silence into art. But I didn't crave the labels. I'd learned that being seen was only meaningful if you stayed true to what had made you invisible in the first place. Honesty, empathy, and the will to create. Meanwhile, Emily disappeared from social media. Her followers plummeted, and her brand collaborations dried up. I didn't celebrate it. I knew too well what it meant to lose the thing that defines you. Then, one night, as I was preparing for a televised interview, a new email arrived in my inbox. The subject line read, "From your sister." I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single line. I didn't know it would hurt this much to be unseen. For the first time in years, I cried. Not out of guilt or anger, but because the echo had finally come back, not with mockery, not with noise, but with understanding. The world had taken my side, yes, but in that moment, I realized that winning wasn't about being right, it was about being free. 3 years passed before I set foot in Austin again. I hadn't planned to return, but when my mother called to say it was the 3rd anniversary of my grandmother's passing and that the family was holding a small memorial dinner, something in me softened. My grandmother had been the only person who'd ever defended me, the only one who used to whisper, "You don't have to shine like Emily. You have your own light." So I agreed to come, not for my parents, not for Emily, but for her. The house hadn't changed. The same white columns, the same manicured lawn, the same air of curated perfection. Only this time, I wasn't the invisible daughter sneaking through the back door. I pulled up in a black sedan, wearing a simple beige dress, my hair tied back. No stylist, no makeup team, just me. When I stepped inside, the noise died for a moment. My mother stood near the dining table, holding a tray of glasses, her expression caught between pride and discomfort. My father looked older, thinner around the eyes. Emily was the first to speak. "Well," she said flatly. "Look who finally decided to show up." "Hi, Emily," I said, offering a polite smile. "It's been a while." She folded her arms. 3 years. But who's counting, right? The dinner began with forced small talk: weather, work, who was living where now. My mother spoke about her new charity events, my father about a business venture that had taken longer than expected. Emily talked about her new job at a marketing agency, careful to emphasize how busy and important her projects were. I listened, nodding, sipping my water. Finally, my mother asked, "So, how's life in New York, dear? You seem to be doing quite well." Her tone was light, but I could feel the tension under it, the unspoken weight of everything that had passed between us. "I'm doing fine," I said simply. "The studio's growing. We just opened a mentorship program for young designers." "Oh." Emily gave a sharp laugh. "Oh, right, the self-made inspiration thing. How's that going?" I ignored the bite in her voice. "It's going well." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "You know, it's funny. Everywhere I go, people ask about you. They think I should be proud of you. But they don't know what you're really like. You talk about family as if we're villains in your story." The room went still. My father cleared his throat, looking anywhere but at us. My mother's hand trembled slightly as she set down her fork. I met Emily's glare calmly. "I never said you were villains. I just told the truth." Her voice rose. "Oh, come on, Lena. You've humiliated this family. You go on stage and talk about being neglected, about leaving us like we were some kind of—" She stopped herself, shaking her head, her face reddening. "You think you're some kind of celebrity now? You embarrassed this family." Her words hit the table like glass shattering. My mother's eyes darted between us, pleading silently for someone to change the subject. My father picked up his napkin, folded it carefully, and placed it down again. I set my glass aside, my voice steady. "No, Emily," I said softly. "I didn't embarrass the family. I just stopped hiding." For a moment, she looked stunned, like she hadn't expected me to answer. Her lips trembled, but pride held her together. "You always act so calm," she snapped. "So perfect. But you're not. You left because you couldn't handle not being the favorite. You made yourself a victim." I felt something inside me crack, not with anger, but with the ache of recognition. The same script, the same story. Always twisting pain into performance. "Maybe," I said quietly. "Or maybe I just wanted a life where I didn't have to fight for permission to exist." The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother reached for her napkin, her hands trembling. "Enough," she whispered. "Please, both of you. Not tonight." But Emily was already shaking, her mascara smudged, her voice breaking. "You think you're better than us now. Everyone worships you online, but I know who you are. You're still that scared little girl who ran away because she couldn't stand being second." She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. The sound echoed like a crack of thunder. "You'll never be part of this family again, Lena. Never. Mun." Then she turned and stormed out, her heels pounding against the tile, the front door slamming behind her so hard the chandelier trembled. For a long time, no one spoke. The air was thick with everything that hadn't been said for years. My mother's face crumpled. She pressed her napkin to her lips to stop herself from crying. My father exhaled slowly, looking away, shame flickering in his eyes. I looked down at my plate, untouched, and said softly, "It's okay." My mother shook her head. "No, it's not. I should have." "You don't need to explain," I interrupted gently. "Some things just build wrong. You can repaint them, polish them, but the cracks are always there." I stood then, pushing my chair back. The sound was soft, deliberate. "I forgive you," I said quietly, looking at both of them. "All of you. Even if you never ask." My mother's tears spilled freely now, and my father turned away, staring out the window into the dark garden. I picked up my coat and walked toward the door. Outside, the night air was cool, scented with rain and jasmine. I paused on the porch, taking one last look at the house, the same one where I'd once stood as an invisible girl watching someone else's celebration. Inside, I could still hear muffled voices, my mother sobbing softly, my father's low murmurs trying to calm her. But Emily's absence hung louder than any sound. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to fix it. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. The past had already spoken, and I'd already answered. As I stepped off the porch, a faint breeze brushed against my face, carrying the scent of wet earth. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, slow and distant, like the closing of a long, heavy chapter. I whispered into the darkness, almost to myself, "I forgive you." And for the first time, the words didn't feel like surrender, they felt like release. After the confrontation, the house fell into a strange kind of stillness. It was the kind of silence that didn't comfort, it hovered, raw and trembling, as if the walls themselves were trying to remember how to breathe. My mother had gone upstairs after Emily's outburst, her sobs fading behind a closed door. My father stayed at the table, staring into his untouched glass of wine, shoulders hunched beneath the weight of everything he'd refused to face for years. I stood there for a long time, watching the remnants of dinner grow cold, candles flickering low, crumbs on fine china, the scent of rosemary and smoke lingering in the air. On the polished wood in front of me lay 3 white envelopes. I had written them before coming here, sealed them before I knew if I would have the courage to leave them behind. Each was marked with a name in black ink: Dad, Mom, Emily. I placed them side by side, perfectly aligned, the way I arranged my layouts at work. The one for my father read, "For teaching me what silence feels like. It's heavier than noise, but stronger too." I carried it for years without realizing it was training. Thank you for showing me what happens when we mistake stillness for peace. I learned that real peace is earned, not granted. I hope one day you'll find yours. The letter for my mother was shorter, but it took me the longest to write. For showing me what not to become. I used to think you were made of perfection, of immaculate dinner tables, polite smiles, and rehearsed laughter. But now I know that image can be a cage. I forgive you for teaching me how to hide. And I thank you for showing me that I never want to live that way again. And finally, Emily's. My handwriting shook when I wrote her name. For reminding me that love must be chosen. Not demanded, not assumed. Chosen. I used to envy how effortlessly people loved you. Now I understand that what looks effortless often comes at someone else's cost. I hope one day you learn to love without taking. I'm still learning that too. I tucked each letter under a folded napkin, a quiet farewell disguised as part of the table setting. My father didn't look up as I walked to the door. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he didn't know how. Outside, the night air smelled like wet leaves and old memories. I stood on the porch for a moment, looking at the windows glowing softly behind the curtains. For the first time, I didn't feel anger or even longing. Just a gentle ache, like the final note of a song fading into silence. When I got back to New York, the city greeted me with its usual indifference, a kind of anonymity that felt like mercy. My studio was quiet when I returned, sunlight pouring through the tall windows, painting long gold lines across the floor. The olive tree in the center had grown taller, its leaves brushed against the light. I sat beneath it, let the stillness settle, and began to think about what I wanted to build next, not for fame, not for recognition, but for meaning. That was how the idea for a room of one's own was born. It started small. A scholarship fund for design students who, like me, had been told they didn't belong, who had been silenced by the people meant to lift them. I wanted it to be more than money. I wanted it to be a home, an incubator for anyone who had ever been pushed out of their own story. We built an online community, mentorship programs, and small grants for creative projects. When I announced it, I didn't expect much. But within a week, dozens of donations poured in from people who had heard my TEDx talk, from former clients, from strangers who said they saw themselves in my story. A major publication picked it up, running the headline, "The girl who built homes for others after never having one herself." The phrase followed me everywhere after that. At first, I thought it sounded melodramatic. But the more I thought about it, the truer it became. Because that's what I had done, without realizing it, built homes, not houses. Homes in the spaces I designed, in the communities I formed, in the silence I reclaimed. One morning, a package arrived at the studio. Inside was a worn photograph of my grandmother holding me as a baby, her handwriting scrawled on the back. "Always build where you are seen." There was no note explaining who had sent it, but I knew it was my mother. For the first time, I smiled instead of crying. Later that week, I received an email from a student who had just been awarded the first room of one's own grant. She wrote, "I grew up in foster care. I've never had a room that was mine, but your story made me believe I could design one for someone else. I think that's what healing is, passing on the space you didn't have." I read her message over and over, the words blurring with tears. That night, I sat by the window of my loft, looking down at the city glowing like a constellation of human stories. Somewhere, people were falling apart. Somewhere else, they were rebuilding. I thought of the letters on that dining table in Charleston, 3 small envelopes that would probably never be mentioned, maybe even thrown away. But it didn't matter. Their purpose wasn't to change anyone else. It was to release me. I whispered a quiet thank you into the empty room. Healing, I realized, wasn't a grand act. It was a slow, deliberate kind of building. It was writing letters you didn't need to send. Planting olive trees that might never bloom. Turning the silence that once hurt you into a space someone else could rest in. And as the night stretched around me, I finally felt what I had been searching for all along, not the love of a family, not the approval of the world, but something smaller and steadier. Peace. A year later, Manhattan glowed beneath me like a sea of quiet stars. From the window of my penthouse loft, I could see the city stretching endlessly, gold and glass, movement and silence braided together in a single, breathing organism. It was the kind of view I used to dream of when I was a girl sitting in the back of a Texas bus, staring out into the night, wondering if I'd ever belong anywhere. Now I sat wrapped in a soft blanket, a cup of tea in hand, the hum of the city below pulsing like a steady heartbeat. The studio was different now. There were new interns, new projects, new lives growing from the roots of what I had built. Room of One's Own had expanded faster than I imagined. It wasn't just a scholarship anymore, but a foundation, with design labs in 3 cities and partnerships with schools that gave students the tools to build careers from courage. Every wall in the office carried a story. Sketches from graduates, photos of their first exhibitions, handwritten notes of gratitude. Sometimes I walked through the gallery late at night just to hear the echo of their laughter still hanging in the air. On this particular evening, the final day of my newest exhibit, I felt no rush to celebrate. The show, Home, had opened that morning to reviews that used words like intimate, transcendent, redemptive. I didn't need the praise anymore. What mattered most was that people came and stood quietly in the space, letting the art breathe around them. That was enough. The exhibit was built as a mirror to my journey. Reclaimed doors suspended from the ceiling, fragments of old mirrors, a table made from the wood of a demolished church, and, in the center, a single glowing room, a cube of light and glass, titled The Room with the Light On. Inside, everything was white and empty, except for one small chair facing the window. Visitors said it felt like peace. For May, it felt like closure. As the sun dipped below the skyline, the last streaks of amber light spilled across the floorboards. I sat by the window, watching the reflection of the exhibit's soft glow flicker across the glass. My phone buzzed beside me. A new email. I glanced at the sender. Mom. I hesitated, staring at the name. It had been months since I'd heard from her. My hand hovered over the mouse before I finally clicked. We watched your new exhibit. It's beautiful. We're proud. There was no preamble, no apology, no attempt to explain the years that had fractured us. Just that. We're proud. For a long time, I didn't move. The city lights shimmered like constellations on the window, and in their reflection, I could almost see her face, the mother who had once valued appearances over honesty, who had loved loudly but imperfectly. The email wasn't a reconciliation, and I didn't need it to be. It was simply acknowledgement, late but real. I smiled, small and quiet, then closed the laptop without replying. Some stories didn't need sequels. The olive tree in the middle of the loft had grown tall now, its leaves brushing the skylight. I stood and walked over to it, touching the bark with the same reverence I once reserved for dreams. The apartment was filled with traces of my life sketches pinned to walls, half-built models, photographs of students standing in front of their own projects. My world, imperfect and complete. When I looked outside again, the reflection of my home merged with the skyline, the city lights flickering like a heartbeat against the glass. I thought about the path that had led me here, the night I walked out of that stolen birthday party, the long bus ride north, the sleepless years of building something from nothing. Pain had been my foundation, but I had built beauty on top of it. I turned off the lamps one by one until the apartment was dark, except for the single glowing cube visible from the adjacent room, the final installation of my exhibit. The room was empty except for that soft, golden light. It glowed like a beacon, steady and gentle, cutting through the dark. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the light spill across the floor and onto the walls. Then I whispered, almost to myself, "Sometimes you don't rebuild the bridge. You build a home on your side of the river." Outside, the wind brushed against the glass, carrying the sound of distant traffic and laughter. Somewhere across the city, people were still building lives, art, hope. I thought of the students I'd met, the letters they'd written, the ones who had taken the scholarship and turned it into something bigger. Their names would live on long after mine faded. That was enough. Before heading to bed, I crossed the living room and stood once more before the glowing cube. Through the glass walls, I could see my own reflection, faintly older now, calmer, softer. I placed my hand against the glass, feeling the faint hum of the lights beneath my palm. It felt like a heartbeat. And for the first time in a very long time, I realized I was no longer chasing belonging. I had built it. I turned off the lights in the rest of the apartment, leaving only the room with the light on shining behind me. Its glow filled the space like a promise, steady, unbroken, alive. Outside, the city continued to hum, oblivious and eternal. Inside, peace stayed.